In the year 1492, Christopher Columbus crossed the ocean in search of a sea route to India. He was absolutely certain that he was making the greatest geographical breakthrough in the history of all mankind. But the Genoese navigator had no idea that he was exactly 500 years too late to the party. The true discoverers of the New World were the rugged northerners who had no intention of discovering anything at all. They stumbled upon a vast new continent entirely by accident, simply because they'd had a terrible day at sea. Modern history loves beautiful legends about determined explorers pursuing a great dream. The Vikings' discovery of America shatters this romantic stereotype completely and irrevocably. It was not a grand scientific project, but an incredibly long chain of mundane navigational errors. Imagine a driver who missed his turn on a highway at night and accidentally drove into a neighboring country. It sounds like the setup for a cheap comedy, but that is exactly how the mighty Scandinavian maritime empire of the early Middle Ages was built. For most Europeans of that time, the world beyond their continent was shrouded in a thick fog of war. They were terrified to take even a single step into the unknown, expecting certain death at the hands of sea monsters or the edge of the earth. The Vikings, however, viewed these raging, salty waters from a completely different perspective. For them, the Northern Ocean was not an insurmountable barrier, but a high-speed highway leading to new opportunities. Instead of waiting for the fog to lift, they simply took their ships and plowed straight into that darkness. They had no chance of safely returning home in the event of a fatal mistake at sea. Every voyage into the open sea demanded incredible physical endurance and a completely cool head. Their grand plan for survival in the north didn't include exploring foreign continents at all. The rugged Scandinavians were simply looking for a place where they could cut down quality timber and peacefully get through the long winter. And for the sake of these basic necessities, they were willing to sail into waters so distant that they would make modern sailors' blood run cold. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? But let's take a closer look at exactly how this epic, centuries-long accident unfolded. We'll trace their journey from their native fjords to the shores of North America, step by step. You'll see how a simple shortage of scaffolding forced people to rewrite the geography of our planet. And most importantly, you'll understand why this incredible story was completely forgotten by the rest of the world for several centuries. In the 8th century, these people set in motion a historical process that can safely be called the Great Migration Westward. They did not leap across the entire Atlantic Ocean at once, because that would have been pure and utter suicide. Instead, they moved in tiny but confident steps from one rocky patch of land to another. It was a brilliant step-by-step route where each new stop automatically became a base for the next leap. And every such historic leap was a game of brutal Russian roulette with icy storms. Modern countries spend colossal budgets on space programs and high-precision satellites to search for new territories. The Vikings did roughly the same thing, only their spaceship was a wooden boat, and their onboard computer was the sun and the birds. They defied nature, armed with nothing but primitive tools and boundless audacity. And the most paradoxical thing about this whole story is that their greatest successes were born out of complete failures. When their plans fell apart, they didn't give up. They simply adapted to the new, harsh reality. This story is not about heroes in shining armor who wanted to bring civilization to new lands. It is the story of pragmatic, tough, and stubborn people whose daily routine consisted of hard labor and survival. They had to feed their families, repair their ships, and find new pastures for their livestock. It was this mundane, everyday necessity that drove them beyond the horizon, forcing them to cross the most dangerous ocean on the planet. And as a result, they accidentally made a discovery whose magnitude they could not even comprehend during their lifetimes. By modern standards, their navigation methods would seem like near-suicidal madness. They had no compasses, sextants, or accurate nautical charts marking dangerous currents. They were given a sturdy ship, shown where the sun set, and sent out to the open sea against the wind. Their training ended the very moment the coast of their native Norway disappeared from view behind the stern. From there on, it was pure improvisation, where their own lives were always on the line. It is not the team of explorers with the most modern and expensive equipment that wins. The group that wins is the one that, by the end of a terrible storm, still has the strength to hold the rudder oar. The Romans built their empire on land, wearing down their enemies with long training sessions and endless marches on foot. The Vikings built their empire on the water, turning their ability to survive in the cold into their main tactical advantage. And it was precisely this unique endurance that allowed them to reach places where no one else in Europe would dare to venture. The Vikings' westward movement did not begin with a sweeping royal decree or a grand military campaign. It was a decentralized initiative by hundreds of independent captains seeking a better life, far from their overpopulated homeland. Early medieval Norway was a harsh, mountainous land where arable land was in critically short supply. People were literally squeezed between sheer cliffs and a cold but fish-rich sea. The water became their only logical escape, the only way to expand their living space. They began by exploring the nearest territories, gradually feeling their way to the Shetland and Faroe Islands. It was a kind of training before entering the big leagues of ocean voyages. Each short crossing helped them hone their shipbuilding and navigation skills in relatively safe conditions. Modern coaches call this the principle of progressive overload, but the Vikings simply called it life. They expanded their horizons slowly, turning every rock they found into a new foothold. Gradually, these short leaps came together to form what historians now call the Great Step-by-Step Route. The idea was to never stray too far from the last known supply point. No one in their right mind attempted to cross the Atlantic in a single, non-stop voyage. That would be like a modern car trying to drive across the Sahara Desert on a single tank of gas. They needed intermediate stops for repairs, rest, and replenishing their fresh water supplies. And that is exactly how, moving along this improvised chain, the Scandinavians reached Iceland in the 9th century. To Europeans of that time, this island seemed like some sort of mythical outpost at the edge of the universe. But for the Vikings, it was simply the next logical step, a new stop on their maritime route. There were hot springs, unclaimed land, and a complete absence of hostile armies or meddlesome kings. In essence, they found the perfect refuge for those who wanted to start life with a clean slate. But this is where it gets really interesting if you look at the technological side of the process. To make such journeys, they needed completely unique vessels capable of withstanding hellish conditions. Their dracars and Norse were true marvels of medieval engineering, centuries ahead of their time. The ship's hull did not resist the waves rigidly, but flexed with them like a living sea serpent. The planks were fastened with overlapping joints, making the structure incredibly strong, yet frighteningly flexible. A modern reenactor once attempted to cross the sea in an exact replica of such a vessel during bad weather. He later recounted that the ship bent beneath his feet so violently that it felt as though it would collapse at any moment. My legs start to ache just from the thought of what it must be like to stand on such a deck for days on end. But it was precisely this frightening flexibility that prevented the icy waves from breaking the wooden hull in half. The technology worked flawlessly, even if it felt to the passengers as though the end of the world were coming. These ships had another ingenious feature, an extremely shallow draft. They could cross raging oceans and then calmly enter the shallowest rivers or dock right on a sandy beach. Modern landing craft operate on exactly the same principle of rapid disembarkation. You don't need a deep water port or a special pier to go ashore and set up camp. You simply drive onto the shore, unload your gear, and immediately get down to business. It was this very mode of transport that made a step-by-step route across the North Atlantic physically possible. People could load not only weapons, but also their sheep, horses, and construction tools on board. These weren't just military raids. They were fully fledged mobile villages riding the waves. Imagine moving to another city but taking your entire house with you, including the foundation and your pets. That's exactly what Viking logistics looked like when they settled on a new rocky island. Each new colony became a springboard for those who hadn't secured land at the previous stop. Iceland quickly filled with ambitious farmers, and open pastures began to run out rapidly. Pressure within society grew, pushing the most restless to look once again toward the setting sun. The ocean was vast, and no one knew what exactly lay beyond the next horizon of fog. But the step-by-step system had already proven its effectiveness, offering hope that there was something else ahead. This method of moving forward worked flawlessly as long as the ships followed a clearly defined plan. But plans on the open sea always crash against the harsh reality of suddenly changing weather. And this is where the most amazing part of our story begins, full of coincidences and luck. Because the next great discoveries were not made by those who knew where they were sailing. They were made by those who managed to get lost in the ocean in the grandest possible way. Navigation in the Viking Age was an art bordering on pure magic and utter madness. These rugged, bearded men had neither magnetic compasses nor detailed maps of the night sky. They navigated by the color of the water, the flight paths of seabirds, and the nature of the ocean swells. Modern pilots use highly sophisticated instruments to land a plane in poor visibility. The Vikings used a piece of crystal, known as a sunstone, to simply determine where the sun was on a cloudy day. But even the most skilled navigators were utterly powerless against sudden Atlantic storms. When thick fog or a fierce hurricane engulfed the ship, the captain lost all his natural landmarks. The ship could be carried by the waves for weeks in a completely unpredictable and unknown direction. The crew had no way to stop, consult a map, or request help via radio. All they could do was bail out the icy water, pray to their harsh gods, and hope for a miracle. It sounds like a one-way ticket to the bottom of the sea, but it was precisely such disasters that became the main driving force behind geographical discoveries. Almost every new patch of land in the West was first spotted by a crew desperately trying not to die. Ships strayed from their planned course, sailed past Iceland, and found themselves in completely uncharted waters. It was a classic example of how a glitch in the system suddenly becomes the main feature. A navigational error became a triumph the moment an unfamiliar coastline appeared on the horizon. Even Iceland itself was originally discovered by a man who simply got lost on his way to the Faroe Islands. His name was Nadod, and his ship was blown so far off course by a storm that he landed on a completely unknown island. He didn't linger there long. He simply looked around, realized it wasn't his destination, and sailed away. But he brought home invaluable information. There is a huge, uninhabited island in the northwest. This rumor spread through taverns and ports faster than modern viral videos on the internet. This is exactly how the system of knowledge exchange worked in early medieval Scandinavian society. Someone would make a mistake, survive, return home, and tell the tale over a mug of strong ale. The next ambitious captain would listen to this tale, memorize the landmarks, and set out purposefully to verify the rumors. No official expeditions sponsored by the crown, no research grants or scientific academies, just word of mouth, a thirst for profit, and a willingness to risk one's own neck for the sake of unclaimed land. Today, we're used to GPS navigators that scream hysterically if you turn down the wrong street. If the Vikings had had GPS, they probably would never have discovered anything new. They would have simply turned around and meekly returned to a safe, long-studied route. But the lack of precise instruments gave them incredible geographical flexibility and freedom of maneuver. Every navigational error could potentially make its owner the master of an entire new archipelago. Imagine the psychological state of people who had been drifting across the icy ocean for weeks without food. They are exhausted, their clothes are soaked through with salt water, and their fresh water supplies have long since gone bad in the barrels. And suddenly, through the thick white fog, they see the outlines of high mountains or green valleys. At that moment, any land seems like paradise, even if it's a barren patch of rock in the middle of nowhere. Their instinct for self-preservation compelled them to carefully memorize the route to this saving refuge. These accidental deviations from their course gradually pushed the boundaries of their known world farther and farther west. Each new mistake shifted the edge of the map several hundred miles toward North America. They groped their way through new territories blindly, like a person walking through a dark room with outstretched arms. Sometimes they crashed painfully into rocks, losing ships and entire crews of experienced sailors. But those who returned brought with them the coordinates of the next saving step in the ocean. This method of trial and error and incredible luck became the foundation of their expansion for several centuries. They grew accustomed to the idea that the ocean was not infinite and that a shore could always lie hidden behind any storm. This psychological confidence allowed them to sail into places where ancient navigators would have long since gone mad with fear. They stopped fearing the unknown because the unknown regularly presented them with new opportunities. And soon, this principle led them to the very edge of the habitable world. But to make the next great leap, they needed a man of a very special character. A man who was simply left with no choice but to sail into the cold void. A mere coincidence had to meet absolute desperation to push people even further. And such a man was found in Iceland at the very end of the 10th century. His name was Erik the Red, and he had very serious problems with the law. The story of the discovery of Greenland is not a tale of a noble quest for new horizons in the name of science. It is a crime drama about a man with an incredibly foul temper and a heavy hand. Erik the Red was banished from Norway for murder, after which he tried to start a new, peaceful life in Iceland. But his hot temper hadn't gone anywhere, and soon he found himself drawn into a bloody feud with his neighbors again. After yet another violent altercation, the local Ting court sentenced him to 3 years of exile. For an ordinary person, exile from the island meant a humiliating return to Scandinavia with his head bowed. But Erik could not return to Norway because his old death sentence still awaited him there. He found himself literally caught between the hammer of justice and the anvil of his own bad reputation. He had only one incredibly risky path left: to sail west into the uncharted icy waters. Old sailors claimed that long ago they had seen some land there when they had strayed far off course. It was a leap of desperation, a step into absolute emptiness with no guarantee of return. Erik gathered his family and his loyal men, loaded supplies onto the ship, and set out straight into the open ocean. After a long and exhausting voyage, he did indeed stumble upon a huge glacier-covered island. It was a harsh, inhospitable land where even in summer the icy wind cut to the bone. But for an exile, it was the perfect, utterly safe haven where there were neither judges nor kings. Erik spent 3 years of his exile carefully exploring the deep fjords of this harsh land. He searched for areas suitable for living and indeed found several narrow strips of greenery in the southwest. By European standards, it was an icy desert, but by the standards of a desperate farmer, quite suitable real estate. When his sentence was up, he returned to Iceland with a brilliant marketing plan. He needed people to found a colony and become the sole ruler of the new territory. It was then that Erik pulled off the greatest PR campaign in the history of the early Middle Ages by coming up with a name for the new island. He called this icy hell Greenland, the Greenland, to attract as many gullible settlers as possible. It sounds like a classic ploy by modern real estate agents selling you a cozy studio that turns out to be a storage room. But this ingenious trick worked flawlessly, and hundreds of Icelanders took the bait. Soon, a whole fleet of 25 ships set sail westward in pursuit of the cunning exile. Only 14 ships reached Greenland. The rest either sank in violent storms or turned back. But those who made it founded settlements that became the westernmost point of European civilization at that time. It was truly the edge of the inhabited world, beyond which there seemed to be nothing but ice and death. Life there demanded absolute concentration of strength, the strictest discipline, and superhuman endurance. The settlers built their homes out of stone and a thick layer of turf simply to keep from freezing in the winter. They raised sheep and hunted seals and walruses, whose tusks became their main export currency. But Greenland harbored a fundamental problem that could not be solved by either hard work or ingenuity. On this gigantic island, there were practically no suitable trees for building sturdy ocean-going ships. Their entire economy, their very survival, depended on the ability to sail, yet there was nothing from which to build boats. This lack of a basic resource became a time bomb under the entire Greenlandic colony. Any modern company would quickly go bankrupt if deprived of its primary means of production and logistics. For the Vikings, losing the ability to build ships meant being trapped forever on an icy rock. They gathered driftwood, logs that ocean currents had accidentally washed up on the shores of their fjords. But there was a catastrophic shortage of rotten, salt-soaked wood to maintain a powerful fleet. The settlers found themselves critically dependent on shipments of expensive timber from Norway and Iceland. It was precisely this daunting isolation and scarcity that forced the Greenlanders to gaze longingly toward the western horizon once again. They understood they could not forever depend on handouts from the mainland, which could be cut off at any moment. The psychological pressure grew with each passing year, forcing the most desperate captains to contemplate new, reckless expeditions. The edge of the world turned out to be not a cozy harbor, but a harsh prison whose walls were slowly closing in. They needed a way out, and, as so often happens in history, it was found again by pure chance. Scarcity is always the best catalyst for progress, forcing people to break out of the familiar boundaries of what is possible. The Romans built aqueducts because they lacked clean water in their overpopulated growing cities. The Vikings sailed to America because they had nothing to make a new mast for their old drakkar. This simple, almost mundane problem set off a chain reaction that forever changed humanity's understanding of the planet. Let's be honest about one thing. Greenland was a terrible place for long-term, comfortable living. Erik the Red could call it as green as he liked, but marketing doesn't override the harsh laws of Arctic nature. The mild climate of the Middle Ages provided only a false sense of temporary safety. But even then, the biting winter winds chilled the colonists to the bone. The settlers quickly realized they had fallen into a massive natural trap. Here, every familiar resource suddenly became worth its weight in gold. You cannot grow wheat on frozen rock, no matter how diligently you plow it, and you certainly cannot chop down a glacier with an axe to build a warm house. They had to survive under conditions of total and unending scarcity of the most basic materials. Farming on the island was limited to tiny, meager vegetable gardens. Growing a decent crop there was a true daily feat. The cold and far too short summer left no chance of building up rich food reserves. Therefore, raising sheep and cows became the main source of valuable calories. But the livestock often starved until spring due to a lack of hay, which made the settlers' lives incredibly precarious. The colonists felt the shortage of iron ore particularly acutely. It was vital for forging weapons, sturdy nails, and reliable agricultural tools. On the island, one could find so-called low-quality bog iron. However, smelting it required enormous amounts of charcoal, which simply wasn't available due to the lack of forests. Without proper nails, repairing any wooden vessel turned into a frustrating test of ingenuity. Craftsmen used wooden dowels and sturdy leather straps. With these, they desperately tried to hold together planks that had been thoroughly battered by fierce ocean storms. A wooden dowel does indeed hold the structure together quite firmly, but this works only until the wood dries out from the relentless passage of time and salt, and when your ship starts falling apart at the seams in the middle of the cold Atlantic. Leather straps certainly won't save you. The Greenlandic Vikings felt much the same way. Every day they looked with undisguised longing at their aging Norse, slowly rotting away with the passing years. These people were born seafarers, accustomed to boldly conquering any waves. But now the sea was slowly and surely taking away their only means of transportation. This prospect of isolation frightened them far more than the bitter cold or the mythical monsters from ancient sagas. Moreover, the colony's population was growing slowly but steadily. Erik the Red had brought hundreds of people with him, and they were constantly having children. This created enormous additional tension within the once close-knit island community. Good grazing land for sheep was becoming catastrophically scarce, and the winters seemed to grow longer and harsher. You simply cannot endlessly divide a single meager ration among a rapidly growing number of hungry mouths. Social tensions within the expanding settlements were rising relentlessly. The situation threatened to erupt at any moment into bloody internal conflicts over the best patches of fertile land. The proud Northerners were not accustomed to giving up their rightful claims without a good fight. Historically, Viking society had always solved the problem of overpopulation in the same tried-and-true way, through bold and reckless expansion into new territories. But where could people trapped on an island expand? To the east lay the icy ocean, a path they had already barely managed to traverse. To the north stretched only endless miles of deadly, treacherous ice. Logic and the basic instinct for self-preservation relentlessly pointed them toward a single correct solution. The only potentially open path led further into the unexplored Wild West. Someone had to risk everything for the colony's survival and check whether the ocean concealed yet another land of salvation. And here, the factor of a monumental navigational error, already familiar to us, comes into play once again. The answer the Greenlanders needed literally sailed right up to their harsh shores. It arrived along with a stubborn captain who had simply lost his way in the turbulent sea. This hapless sailor's name was Bjarni Herjolfsson. His maritime story is a veritable apotheosis of historical curiosities and absurdly missed opportunities. Bjarni was a highly successful and pragmatic merchant of his harsh era. He regularly and confidently sailed between Iceland and Norway, earning a very decent living from it. Once, after a successful season, he returned to his native Iceland with full holds. There, to his great surprise, he learned that his father had sold the farm and sailed off with Erik the Red into the unknown. As a devoted and good son, Bjarni was determined to follow his father, yet he had no idea of the exact route to this mysterious Greenland. He simply assembled a loyal crew, shrugged his shoulders, and boldly steered his heavily laden ship westward. His summer voyage became a classic example of how all plans can collapse in an instant. After just a few days of calm sailing, the weather took a sharp and irreversible turn for the worse. The wooden ship was engulfed by an impenetrable, thick fog, accompanied by a biting north wind. This wild force of nature dragged the helpless vessel in a completely unknown direction for days on end. Before the astonished Vikings lay a gentle, welcoming shore. It was densely covered with pristine, incredibly tall and green forests. There was not even the slightest hint of harsh glaciers, rocks, or eternal snow. This was precisely the priceless resource that all the Greenlandic colonists had so desperately dreamed of for many years. Bjarne had miraculously found a solution to their most pressing problem. He did so without even realizing it and with absolutely no intention of achieving such a feat. His ship had accidentally stumbled upon the eastern coast of the vast North America. Thus, a simple merchant became the very first European to see the new continent with his own eyes. And it is precisely here that the most incredible and truly comical event in this entire grand historical saga takes place. The merchant Bjarne Herjolfsson gazed thoughtfully at these boundless expanses. He surveyed the dense virgin forests, full of incredibly valuable timber. And then he made a decision that would be absolutely shocking to any explorer. The captain categorically refused to go ashore on this alluring green coast and strictly forbade his weary crew from leaving the ship. Why did he act so strangely at this historic moment? It's very simple. He needed to sail to Greenland to his father, and this strange, densely forested land did not match the verbal description he had at all. He literally looked at the greatest geographical discovery of the millennium and said matter-of-factly, "No, I'm going the other way." And without a shadow of a doubt, he ordered the heavy ship to turn back out to the open sea. To any modern person, Bjarne's actions seem utterly insane. They demonstrate a total, almost pathological lack of even a shred of the spirit of exploration. Imagine you accidentally discover a new, vast continent, untouched by anyone before you, and you simply sail away in silence without even attempting to collect a few basic souvenirs as mementos. Any modern scientist would give his right arm without a second thought for such a unique opportunity to be the first to set foot on unknown land. But Bjarne Herjolfsson was not an inquisitive scientist, a brave explorer, or a naive romantic. He didn't dream of immortal glory or of having his name printed in history textbooks. He was a thoroughly pragmatic medieval merchant with a very clear logistical plan and a strict delivery schedule. To his business mind, this land covered in magnificent forest held no interest whatsoever. It was simply an annoying navigational obstacle and a clear sign that he had seriously strayed from his intended course. Landing on any unknown, wild shore always carried enormous dangers. These were huge and completely unjustified risks for both the fragile ship itself and the valuable cargo in its holds. This mysterious shore could very well be inhabited by extremely aggressive natives. Dangerous and ferocious wild beasts might lurk in the dense shadows of the forests. And as the ship approached the alluring shore, hidden, treacherous underwater rocks could always pose a threat. Bjarne had a very valuable cargo on board, which he planned to sell at the highest possible profit in Greenland. Risking his well-established business for the sake of the dubious pleasure of strolling through an unfamiliar forest was categorically against his strict rules. Bjarne turned out to be just such a meticulous and task-focused maritime courier. Only instead of a cardboard pizza box, he had a wooden merchant ship, and instead of glittering Hollywood, virgin America stretched out before him. The merchant methodically turned his ship around and sailed cautiously along the unfamiliar coastline for several more days. He stubbornly surveyed the shores as they passed by until he was finally convinced that this was definitely not Greenland. During this voyage along the shores of the new land, the exhausted crew spotted several more large islands. The contours of the shores were constantly changing. Green forests gave way to flat plains, but nowhere were the familiar white glaciers to be seen. The sailors grumbled quietly and begged the captain to stop, if only to quickly replenish their fresh water supplies. But Bjarni remained unyielding in his strange stubbornness and had no intention of wasting precious time on unnecessary stops. When he finally reached the right ice island and joyfully greeted his father, he honestly recounted his adventure. The reaction of the local Greenlandic Vikings to this travel tale was entirely predictable. They were genuinely shocked and even deeply angered by such merchant short-sightedness. Their new neighbor had just seen with his own eyes the endless supplies of high-quality timber they so desperately needed every day. And this remarkable man hadn't even bothered to chop down a couple of sturdy logs on his long journey back. He could have easily brought back samples of the precious timber to prove his point with concrete evidence. Bjarnir instantly became the main target of numerous hurtful taunts. He was harshly criticized for his glaring lack of natural curiosity and healthy masculine initiative. Later, he was openly condemned, even at the lavish court of the powerful Norwegian Jarl. Bjarni subsequently arrived there with a detailed account of his long and circuitous sea voyages. The nobles genuinely could not understand how one could display such truly fantastic indifference toward vast new lands. But despite all the scathing mockery, Bjarni's casual account achieved the most important thing. It planted an incredibly clear idea in the minds of the desperate Greenlanders. Now, these rugged people knew one undeniable and joyful truth for certain. They understood that somewhere out there to the west, just a few days' dangerous journey away, lay a vast, life-saving forest. The respected merchant's story no longer seemed like a beautiful myth or a ridiculous drunken tale from a port tavern. These were entirely real, tangible, and incredibly precise coordinates for their collective salvation from the looming isolation. The fervent rumors about this wondrous, densely forested land greatly stirred people's imaginations. They had a particularly powerful effect on the minds of the young, passionate, and highly ambitious colonists. On long winter evenings, they sat in their cramped, bone-chilling turf huts. The Vikings monotonously repaired their cracked fishing boats and passionately dreamed of that distant, endless forest. That very same invaluable information, which the pragmatic Bjarni had simply ignored, became incredibly important. It quickly turned into the most valuable and actively discussed resource in all of Greenlandic society. It's as if someone had accidentally left a piece of paper with the password to a massive Bitcoin wallet right on the table in a noisy, crowded bar. Sooner or later, there would inevitably be a desperate daredevil in the crowd who would decide to check whether this mysterious password worked. And predictably, that determined daredevil turned out to be a man with a simply excellent, distinguished lineage. He possessed a brave heart and a completely irresistible wild craving for risky adventures. His name was Leif Erikson, and he was the biological son of none other than Erik the Red, the great founder of the island colony. Leif listened very carefully to all the details of Bjarnir's strange route, thoroughly analyzed the risks, and made a tough, purely commercial decision. The young leader understood one simple yet brilliant economic truth with crystal clarity. Whoever was the first to bring high-quality construction timber from this new, unnamed land would instantly become an incredibly influential and wealthy man. It was a monumental business opportunity, the kind that comes along only once in a lifetime. It was simply physically impossible to turn it down under the harsh conditions of Greenland's total shortage. Leif approached the organization of such a complex maritime expedition with frightening calculation. He acted with the cold methodicalness of a truly experienced modern corporate manager. He did not waste precious time building a completely new ship from scratch. He simply bought a sturdy vessel from Bjarni Herjolfsson himself. The logic behind this move was absolutely flawless. This ship had already found the desired green shore once, which meant it was bound to find it again. These rugged, bearded men had absolutely no intention of grandly discovering America or inscribing their names in the golden annals of world history. They simply intended to successfully pull off an extremely profitable trade operation to extract scarce resources in neutral waters. This is a very important psychological point that is all too often lost in the grandiose and romanticized historical chronicles of the noble Vikings. The greatest discovery of an entire continent was for them merely an accidental side effect of their insatiable thirst for high-quality planks to build new ships. And with this pragmatic mindset, Leif Erikson hoisted the sail and set the ship's bow toward destiny. Leif Erikson did not improvise on the open sea. He decided to play it safe. His plan was ingeniously simple. He decided to follow Bjarni's route exactly, but in the opposite direction. Leif needed to travel from the glaciers to the forests. It was like unraveling a ball of thread, moving carefully from the end back to the very beginning. This tactic minimized navigational risks, allowing the crew to conserve their strength for landing. The first land they came upon was utterly inhospitable and bleak. It was a flat, rocky expanse dotted with glaciers, without a single blade of grass or bush. Leif, being a practical man, named it Helleland, land of flat stones, modern-day Baffin Island. They went ashore, saw that there was nothing to be gained there, and quickly returned to the ship. This was clearly not the fairy tale forest that the hapless merchant had been raving about in the taverns. They moved further south along the coastline, scanning the horizon intently. Soon, the landscape changed dramatically, and the cliffs gave way to flat white beaches and dense trees. Leif named this place Markland, forest land, likely modern-day Labrador Peninsula. There it was, the very reason this deadly, dangerous adventure of buying an old ship had been undertaken. The crew was thrilled, but Leif reasoned that if they sailed further south, the climate would improve even more. They sailed for 2 more days, driven by a favorable north wind, until they reached a truly incredible place. The ship entered the strait between the island and the mainland, dropping anchor in shallow water. When the Vikings went ashore, they could not believe their eyes. So different was this land from Greenland. The air was warm, the grass tall and lush, and the trees seemed like endless giants. By the standards of people who had grown up on an icy rock, they had literally stepped into a Scandinavian version of paradise. The grass here was so sweet that the dew on it seemed to them like real natural honey. In the rivers, salmon of such enormous sizes splashed about, larger than they had ever seen even in the richest Norwegian fjords. But most importantly, magnificent tall timber grew everywhere, perfectly suited for shipbuilding. It was absolute abundance, a jackpot won by people who were used to saving every scrap. Leif Erikson realized they had hit the jackpot and ordered a temporary camp to be set up there. They built sturdy wooden huts, enjoying the process of cutting down trees, which they now had in abundance. Winter in this region turned out to be surprisingly mild. There was almost no snow, and livestock could graze year-round. Greenlandic farmers, accustomed to slaughtering animals in the fall due to a shortage of hay, were stunned by such a climate. Nature itself offered them everything necessary for a comfortable and well-fed life without any extra effort. Modern people would experience a similar feeling if they happened to find a planet made of pure gold. But the biggest surprise awaited them when they began to explore the area around their camp in more detail. One of the team members, a German named Turkir, once went into the forest and returned absolutely happy and a little drunk. He had found wild grapes growing there in such abundance that they could be gathered by the bucketful. For Northerners, grapes were an exotic treat, a symbol of the unimaginable luxury and wealth of southern kings. That is why Leif immediately gave this territory its most famous name, Vinland, or the land of grapes. They spent the entire winter in Vinland, harvesting timber, gathering grapes, and catching giant salmon. By spring, the crew had loaded the ship so heavily with supplies that it could barely stay afloat. Leif returned home a resounding triumph, having fulfilled his commercial mission 200%. He brought back to Greenland timber, the status of a hero, and a tale of a land where rivers of milk flow and shores of jelly. This expedition became the main catalyst for a new wave of migration westward. But Leif Erikson's story essentially ends here, giving way to other ambitious heroes. He himself inherited power over Greenland after his father's death and never returned to Vinland. Governing the colony turned out to be far more important and profitable than personally chopping wood at the edge of the world. However, his successful example proved to others that the Western route worked and yielded enormous profits. Pandora's box had been officially opened, and the next expedition was only a matter of time. The Vikings' discovery of America is a stunning story that completely overturns our understanding of great achievements. It lacks the usual grandeur of exploratory missions, royal mandates, and philosophical musings on the shape of the earth. This is the story of tough, pragmatic people who solved their everyday problems with incredible courage and axes. They weren't looking for the new world. They were simply looking for good planks to repair their old, leaky boats. And in this mundane, everyday motivation lies the incredible irony of all human history. The greatest achievements often become an accidental byproduct of our attempt to simply survive and make life a little more comfortable. The step-by-step route across the Atlantic was not a brilliant plan. It was the only physically possible way to move forward. Navigational errors, storms, and fogs that were supposed to kill these sailors ultimately made them immortal. Bjarnir Herjolfsson, who ignored an entire continent for the sake of a delivery schedule, seems comical today, but he was a product of his time. For them, the ocean was not an obstacle, but a workplace, where emotion always gave way to cold calculation. Ultimately, the Vikings never grasped the true scale of what they had stumbled upon. To them, North America was simply another large island west of Greenland, full of forests and problems. They did not build an empire because their logistical capabilities were exhausted by the colossal distances and the hostility of the local inhabitants. Information about this land remained locked away in the Icelandic sagas, becoming a beautiful legend for long winter evenings by the fire. And it was only hundreds of years later that archaeologists confirmed what these people had known from the very beginning.